we're going to take a huge leap, if you will, from the time of Ovid, from the time of the early days of the Roman Empire, and we're going to leap right toward the late part of the medieval time period, which seems almost a sin to me to leapfrog all of that, because there would be the assumption in that nothing has taken place between Ovid, between the time of Christ, all the way up until the time of Middle English, if you will. But that is not true. So much has taken place. We've seen the decline of the Roman Empire that will go and last for centuries. Ultimately, that will result when the church will become the official church of the empire. And in many ways, the church will be the salvation, no pun intended in this case, of the empire, because the control will still remain in Rome, but that control will become the church rather than the emperor. And the emperor as such will become the pope. However, the biggest thing that's going to be different is by the time we get to the medieval time period, what was an empire is now breaking up into a system of city-states. So instead of thinking of the entire region here as a kind of single empire, it would be better to think of it as city-states. So in other words, cities that have their own little kings, their own little landowners, and underneath these landowners will be people who work for them. Now they would definitely not like the idea of being called owned by them, but it's difficult to see how it's different to be, say, a serf on a landowner's land, because you would work the land, and part of what you would do as a serf is much of your work goes to the landowner, goes to the overall aspect of his land, and to others who work, and the soldiers that are a part of it, and the clergy, and others such as the blacksmith, and all these things that still belong to the landowner. So if you will, each little city-state is itself a kind of repressive authoritarian state. And so instead of nations, much smaller, the city-state. And so instead of a few kings throughout Europe, we're going to have lots of little kings. And each landowner is himself a kind of mini king. And then that king would be subject to the larger king. And then that king would be subject to the church. Now, one of the things that's interesting is how do you have order in a system like that? What is it that's going to keep people from rebelling, if you will? Well, you're going to have to develop a system, because the landowner certainly controls his land, and he's got a castle often on his land, and that castle is meant to be a protection not just of the landowner's family, but of the land itself. It's also somewhat of an intimidation to the landowners, or the land workers, to remind them who works. But that land really ultimately belongs to the king. And so those landowners, who are themselves mini kings, are subject to a larger king. And that king would then be subject to the church. And how do you manage that? Well, you've got to have a system in place, a kind of unwritten system in some ways, but it was definitely hard and fast, much in the same way that in the ancient world with the Greeks and the biblical world, the Hebrews, and later the Jews, but even the Romans have the virtue and the rules of xenia, of that hospitality, to keep order in the region. In the same way, we needed a new system to make this all hold together, something that reminded everyone that the order in which you were born is is dictated by God. That if you were born a landowner, that's because God had ordained you to be a landowner, and that's where you will be for the rest of your life. But if you were born a serf, a lowly serf working the field, where most of his or her work goes to the benefit of the landowner, well, that was deemed by God as well. And you would never challenge, ever. You would never challenge uh, the authority above you, nor would the landowner challenge the authority above him, the king, and nor would he challenge the authority ultimately of the Pope. And so there's the sense of a divine right that cannot be challenged, because if you challenge that, you're challenging God. But there also needed to be a system that kept order, and that order meant that the landowners or the knights needed to take care of their people, because you couldn't just have the people uh, not taken care of, because then they would rebel. You needed the people taken care of. And so you get a new system, which we call chivalry. And we often talk about chivalry is dead. And I love when we talk about chivalry, because today I think we think of chivalry as something as simple as a guy needs to pull out the chair for a young lady, or open the door, pay for the money, pay for a meal at a date. I'm not sure that that's actually chivalry. I would actually just call that manners that we have all agreed upon, and manners change. And in that sense, we could argue that those are old-fashioned manners, and maybe they need to change, but it's not the same as chivalry. Chivalry is a system that takes for granted the idea that God has ordained your station in life, and that as a result of your station, particularly as a landowner or a knight, particularly as somebody who has been ordained by God to have people under them, you have a set of rules that need to be uh, attended to. And this would be an example of how they would look. And let's see if this is something you think is dead, or you think it's just kind of changed shape a little bit. But the code that of chivalry that Sir Gawain is living under, the same one all the other knights of Arthur's Round Table, the same code that Arthur himself is living under, would be this: to believe the church's teachings and observe all the church's directions. So you're loyal to the church. You acknowledge the authority of the church. You defend the church. If anyone is attacking the church, whether theologically or physically, you would be there to be the first line of defense, to stick up for the church, which is why part of why you have an education, so you can be educated to defend the church. That you would respect and defend all weaknesses. You have people whose life is dependent on you, and as a Christian, then you are expected to take care of those people. Those are like your children, if you will, and you're expected to take care of them. And this is people even who are incapable of working, people who are crippled, widows, orphans, that you must love your country. In other words, you're subject to a king, and you would love your country, that under which the king is the ruler. You would not recoil before an enemy. You see, sometimes the king would call on the landowners or the knights to come and fight, and you would not recoil. You would not turn your back. You would say, yes, my king and country have called on me. I will answer the call. You will die fighting rather than show weakness. Part of the chivalry is that as a knight, that you will show bravery. You might be afraid, but don't show the weakness. Why? Because others are looking at you. The people under you are looking at you. The soldiers under you are looking at you as an example. And if you show weakness, then they will have weakness. That you'll show no mercy to blasphemers. So if somebody is blaspheming God, no mercy for them. That you will perform all duties that agree with the laws of God. That you will be true to the commands of God and the commands of the church. You'll never lie or go back on your word. This is a big deal in chivalry. So if you make a promise, then it's expected that you will keep that promise. This is a culture that's just barely holding on with very tenuous agreements. And the only thing that's going to make things stable is the reliability of the word of a noble or a knight or landowner. So if you make a promise, if you say something that you will not lie and you will hold to that word, there will be story after story from this time period that will rely on this, that you will be generous to everyone above and below you. You will be generous from the lowliest serf to those who are managing the serfs, to those who are skilled tradespeople, everything from carpenters to blacksmith to tinsmiths. And of course, you will always and everywhere be right and good against evil and injustice. Boy, who wouldn't want a guy that looks like that, right? I mean, doesn't that pretty much sound like every person's dream to have someone like that? So when we talk about chivalry being dead, I think in many ways you could argue that it is. You could argue that we no longer live in a culture where someone's word is their bond, where they will defend the church, that they will live an upright life, that they will take care of the weak, that they will take care of all people that they are capable of taking care of, and that they will be generous in all ways. I don't know that that's much of a value, but then again, we live in a culture that uh, the things that sustain it are definitely more stable than just the word of landowners, because we have law, and that very much has changed much of how we look at things. And this is the context on which Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is written. As a matter of fact, it's written likely as a means, a parable, if you will, to train young men in particular in the art of chivalry. It's clearly meant as a delightful piece because the poetry in it is so rich and it's just a joy to read aloud. But it clearly, with the situation that gets set up where you have a Green Knight who's going to show up on Christmas Eve here. And like almost all of a lot of our significant medieval texts, we only have one manuscript that actually has this story. It's the Cotton Nero, much as the same way as Beowulf exists only on one manuscript. So we're grateful for that. The Cotton Nero actually was found in someone's attic, I believe, centuries later. It's a manuscript that's about the size of your hand, just a little booklet, and it's got pictures in it and everything. We have a green knight who comes in, disrupting Arthur and his knights in their Christmas revelry, and he says, "I've got a game. Someone can take a whack at my head, and then I get to take a whack at them, and no one will do it because they think it's a ludicrous idea." And finally, King Arthur feels a little ashamed that none of his knights will stand up for him, so he says he will do it. But the youngest of all the knights, Gawain, will actually stand up and he'll say, "I'll do it." So he takes a whack at the Green Knight's head, cuts it off, and the Green Knight picks up the head and says, "Thank you very much. And in a year's time, I want you to come to my castle and I'll whack off your head." And thus, we'll have Gawain, who a year later will set out on a journey, and he will be tested in the art of chivalry. He will be tested as far as his morality and his loyalty to the laws of God. He'll be tested by what turns out to actually be the wife of the Green Knight. He will be tested in fear. Will he flinch when the blade comes down? And he will be tested on trusting, because will he take that girdle or not, or will he lie about it? These are all interesting texts. Now, one of the things that gets mentioned, I always think is worth noting, is you get the sense that there are castles everywhere, or at least churches or chapels. The chapels that are spoken of in the Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is often nothing more than a cave. Because remember, when you have a religious system that's built on your salvation, dependent on taking the blood and the body of Christ, then they would set up little travel chapels, often in caves. You go in and there'd be a nice altar that you could find, a place where you could then have a private service and take the bread and the wine. We have those still today. I don't know if you've ever been to the beautiful chapel of Our Holy Family that's located between Lincoln and Omaha. Beautiful glass chapel. And that's actually for travelers to come and have. They could take the Eucharist if they want, or just have a moment of prayer. So as you are reading this text, I want you to be aware that this is meant to be a means to train young men in the art of chivalry. One of the questions that we're going to be exploring this week is, do you think chivalry is dead, or has it really been altered into something else? Was it something that was needed for its time and now isn't? And then the fourth session that we're going to ask you to look at is Chaucer, who about 4 centuries after this text is going to write a delicious story in his Canterbury Tales that is meant to be a spoof on Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, and an absolute brutal spoof on chivalry. So if you like chivalry, I think you're going to find this as a kind of a cringe-worthy spoof. But even if you do, I think you're going to leave that tale feeling delighted. Anyway, I have a question for you afterwards, and I look forward to hearing your responses. And let's have a great week enjoying the legends of King Arthur. Now, if I could say one more thing about Arthur, I think Arthur is easily the most significant of our myths in English. And one of the things that's really interesting about Arthur, very different from, say, the heroes of the Greeks and the Romans, where you have an apparent craving, if you will, for a good authoritarian. We want a good king. We want someone who's going to come and rule, but to do so in a righteous fashion. Now, that idea would seem strange to the Greeks, because the Greeks don't like the idea of there being an authoritarian. I mean, much of what we get from the Greeks is from Athens, where we have the first democracy. But certainly in medieval time, they would understand that people's craving for a good monarch. It's interesting today, though, when today we would never crave a monarch. We would never even look at our rulers and our politicians as that kind of authoritative monarch. And yet there still is that love of Camelot, this ideal that our leaders will be very moral, that our leaders will be good through and through. What's interesting is that even in the Arthur story, Arthur ends up completely humiliated in the end. He will be defeated in the end. That even the great Merlin, his aide, who's full of magic, will be defeated by Arthur's half-sister, Morgan Le Fay, and she will ultimately win. The Arthur's legend is interesting to me because it definitely reflects our need and our desire for good righteous leaders. But I think ultimately the Arthur legend points to the fact in the end that there are none, and that we should not expect that. We're not going to get into the Arthur legends as much as I would like, but if any of you are interested in studying chivalry, Arthur, that'd be a wonderful paper, by the way. I think that is well worth reading. And why is it that we still are drawn to Arthur? Anyway, we're going to have a great week, and I think you're going to love this story. Make sure you read this one all the way through, enjoy it, and take note in the beautiful poetry of it, the consonants of every line. It'll just feel good in your mouth. If you're struggling with it, read it aloud. Read it aloud. All right, let's have a great week.